there's this beautiful but also terrible irony to the landscape James Jarvis calls home. His farm, High Place, is literally perched above all the suffering.
It is, isn't it?
Mm.
The soil up there is rich, the mists feed the grass, everything is ordered in green.
But then you look down into the valleys of Ch.18, and the land is just red, bare, eroded. It's a perfect symbol, really.
It absolutely is. And that physical geography is the perfect frame for our deep dive today. Jarvis is comfortable up there, used to looking down on problems he doesn't really feel are his to solve.
Yeah.
He's the embodiment of traditional privilege South Africa.
And that entire world, a world built on that very order and distance, is about to be just shattered by a police car arriving from Johannesburg. So today, we are immersing ourselves in the source material you shared, specifically chapters 18 through 23 of Cry, the Beloved Country. We're going to be tracking what is essentially James Jarvis's forced political and moral awakening. And we have two critical mission questions guiding us. First, how does Jarvis react when he reads his murdered son Arthur's radical writings? Is he going to become more understanding, or will that grief just curdle into anger and prejudice?
And second, we really have to compare the two father-son tragedies here, Jarvis and Arthur and Khumalo and Absalom. How do these really personal losses, these disconnected relationships, how do they mirror the larger broken problems of South Africa itself?
What do they symbolize? We're basically witnessing the moment a personal tragedy becomes a national conscience.
That's it, exactly.
Okay, so let's unpack this quiet life that's about to explode. In chapter 18, we find Jarvis just sort of musing on the land.
Yeah, he knows the valleys are devastated. He sees the erosion, the effects of too many cattle, and what he thinks of is the ignorant people who won't use proper farming methods.
And that's the key mindset, right? We have to lock onto that. For Jarvis, the problem is external. It's a failure of the tenants below, not a failure of the system that dictates how they live.
Precisely. He's just turning over those same old thoughts. The boys get an education, they leave for the towns, and the traditional way of life, flawed as it is dying. He's already the whole problem is impossible.
And then that impossibility hits him right in the face.
Yeah.
A police car arrives at High Place. The sources describe it as coming right out of a cloudless sky. The captain tells him his only son, Arthur, was shot dead at 1:30 p.m. this afternoon in Johannesburg. The killer was a native housebreaker.
And that immediate reaction is just profound, quiet shock. It's not rage, it's disbelief. He just asks, my God. And his first thought, his whole world just shrinks to his wife.
Right. He whispers about how hard it will be to tell her she isn't strong.
It strips away everything else, the politics, the farm, the order. He's just a stunned, grieving husband and father.
So Jarvis travels to Johannesburg and he meets John Harrison, his son's brother-in-law. And this is where that gap between father and son becomes a physical, painful reality.
Yeah, Harrison starts talking about Arthur's work, his deep involvement, his paper on the truth about native crime.
And Jarvis has to admit, almost sheepishly, that he and Arthur didn't see eye to eye on the native question.
He knew there was a difference of opinion, sure.
Yeah.
But he learned so quickly that his son wasn't just, debating politics over dinner. Arthur was an active missionary, kicking up a hell of a dust about hospital conditions, fighting for fundamental changes to the mine labor system.
He was even being pressured to run for office.
Exactly. Jarvis realizes he's come to bury a stranger, a man whose entire moral and political life was lived in opposition to the very passive acceptance of the status quo that he himself represented.
So Jarvis goes to his son's house, and the narrative takes us straight into Arthur's study in chapter 20. And this study is really the silent biography of the man Arthur was.
It is. It's packed with hundreds of books, and the sources make a point to mention that many are about Abraham Lincoln. That's crucial context.
And those 4 pictures on the wall are so telling. You have Christ crucified, Abraham Lincoln, the beautiful white gabled house of Vergeleten, and then willows by a wintry river.
2 symbols of suffering and moral reckoning, and 2 of tradition and peace. Arthur was trying to bridge those 2 worlds.
Then he finds Arthur's papers, and the scope of his work is just stunning. He wasn't just an idealist. He was an organizer-president of the Claremont African Boys Club.
But the real reckoning, it comes from reading that unfinished manuscript. That's where Arthur lays out his vision and, more importantly, his crushing indictment of the world his father inhabits.
Let's talk about those core arguments, because they are direct attacks on the very economy that made James Jarvis a wealthy man. First, Arthur argues that sure, they used unskilled men, but it is not permissible to keep men unskilled for the sake of unskilled work.
Exactly. You cannot systematically repress human potential just for cheap labor.
And then he moves on to the moral decay caused by industrialization. He declares that destroying family life in the mine compounds is no longer permissible now that the terrible human cost is known.
These aren't policy suggestions he's making. They are moral verdicts on a system that's founded on exploitation.
He also says that it's just sheer exploitation to mine gold or cultivate land if the entire thing relies on keeping labor poor.
And then comes the big one, the political indictment that applies directly to High Place and those bare valleys of Nut Cheney. They were, he says, caught in the toils of our own selfishness by reserving only 1/10 of the land for 4/5 of the people.
Wow. Arthur isn't just pointing out a flaw, he's calling the entire system a sin. He demands that the destruction of the tribal system, the very thing Jarvis sees decaying below him, must be replaced by another system of order and tradition and convention.
They created the vacuum, and they have a moral duty to fill it.
And what's so fascinating is that unfinished piece, where Arthur describes the dilemma of their so-called Christian civilization. They preach brotherhood, but they absolutely refuse to practice it in South Africa. They use God to justify repression, believing he created black men to hew wood and draw water for the white minority. And the final chilling words Arthur ever wrote were, "Allow me a minute."
That unfinished line, allow me a minute. It just hangs there, doesn't it? It's the definitive statement of a life cut short right when he was about to articulate his deepest truth. It forces James Jarvis, and it forces you, the listener, to just pause and wait for an answer that will never come.
So this brings us to our first mission question. How does all this affect James Jarvis? Does this overwhelming grief, this ideological confrontation, does it push him toward anger and prejudice or toward understanding?
Well, the sources point very strongly away from him hardening. Jarvis is described as deeply moved. He doesn't immediately agree with all of it, of course not. But he feels this profound regret that he never took the time to study these things, to really engage with these ideas.
He realizes his life of quiet contentment was based on a kind of willful ignorance.
It was. And the key to his shift is that reference point, Abraham Lincoln. Jarvis reads the second inaugural address, which is all about national reconciliation and shared responsibility for a nation's wounds. He feels, and this is a quote, a secret unfolding, a track picked up again.
That connection is just so powerful. Lincoln's address frames the Civil War as a divine punishment for the sin of slavery, and it calls for malice toward none.
Right. And for Jarvis, realizing that Arthur anchored his radicalism in this deep moral and spiritual context, it allows him to accept his son's views not as some political rebellion, but as a moral imperative.
It helps him see the South African tragedy as a shared national guilt, not just native crime.
Exactly. And his response is actionable. He doesn't just go back to High Place to sit in his grief. He asks his son-in-law, John Harrison, to take him to see the Boys Club in Claremont.
The center of Arthur's activism.
Yes. He is choosing to step onto the path Arthur laid out. He's choosing understanding, not bitterness.
So while Jarvis is having this quiet moral conversion, the other side of the tragedy, Stephen Khumalo, is facing the brutal reality of the legal system.
And the court setting itself is a symbol of the segregated state, isn't it? It emphasizes that even justice is delivered through a lens of racial division.
The atmosphere is just so heavy. Absalom Khumalo, along with his cousin and another man, are charged with Arthur's murder. And Absalom pleads guilty to the killing, but not the murder. He insists he did not mean to kill.
Which, of course, the prosecutor won't accept. He forces him to plead not guilty to murder, so the full machinery of the state can be brought against him.
It's Absalom's testimony that really reveals the moral vacuum that Arthur was warning about. He admits he carried the loaded revolver to frighten the servant, but shot Arthur out of fear.
And when he's asked why he prayed for forgiveness afterwards, his answer is just devastating in its simplicity. He just says, because I was in trouble.
There's no deep remorse there.
No, it's just fear of consequence.
And that's the perfect pivot to our second mission question, the symbolism of these two father-son relationships. The Jarvis and Arthur relationship was separated by geography and ideology, but Arthur's moral presence, captured in his writing, was powerful enough to redeem his father even after death.
Yes, that relationship symbolizes the need for the white, powerful generation to accept responsibility. James Jarvis has to inherit the burden of his son's vision. Arthur's clarity forces accountability.
Now, you contrast that with Khumalo and Absalom. They are physically in the same room, but they are completely severed, spiritually and morally. Absalom even admits he knew his priest father would not bless such a bar, talking about the murder weapon.
He just abandoned his father's teachings for the, violent opportunism of the city. The Kamala relationship symbolizes the result of the broken system. Absalom is the consequence. He is what happens when that moral and tribal fabric disintegrates.
He's fear, chaos, and moral drift made manifest.
Yes. And the meeting of these two symbolic worlds is the most heartbreaking moment. Outside the courtroom, Stephen Kumalo sees James Jarvis.
And Kumalo trembles. The source asks, how does one look at such a man? The two fathers, brought together by this immense shared grief, remain separated by custom, by systemic injustice, and just debilitating fear.
They can only acknowledge each other through that shared pain, not through shared humanity. Not yet, anyway.
And as this intensely personal drama unfolds, the source material pulls the lens back to remind us that the national problems are so much bigger. South Africa's attention is violently pulled away by a massive, chaotic distraction.
The discovery of rich gold at Odendahl's Rust.
Yes, chapter 23. The energy just changes completely. The stock exchange goes absolutely mad. Share prices are skyrocketing. Tweed goes from 20 shillings to 80 shillings or more overnight.
You can just imagine the frenzied greed sweeping through Johannesburg, completely eclipsing the tragic trial happening just blocks away.
And this rush for wealth immediately sets up the exact moral dilemma that Arthur wrote about. People like Harrison, Mary's father, they're completely entrenched in the Johannesburg fear and opportunism.
Oh, yeah. He's railing against native crime, demanding more police, defending the mines as the bedrock of the country. He thinks the new gold will just create more jobs, bigger and better compounds.
But the activists, the people inspired by Arthur's spirit, they're arguing the exact opposite. Father Beresford points out that sudden massive profit could have been used to fund Arthur's vision.
Anti-erosion works, boys' clubs, proper hospitals, all of it.
The conflict is so stark. It's rapid, selfish wealth versus moral responsibility. Is this new gold field just going to create another Johannesburg?
Harrison sees economic opportunity. The reformers see a chance for moral renewal. And the key debate here involves Sir Ernest Oppenheimer, who suggests using this new gold field to finally try Arthur's vision for labor.
Settled mine labor in villages, not compounds.
Meaning families and dignity rather than the destructive migrant labor system.
And the chapter leaves us with this profound uncertainty. The country is standing on a literal new seam of wealth, but also a new moral precipice. The sources conclude this section with a devastating thought that just summarizes the stakes. No second Johannesburg is needed upon the earth. One is.
It just emphasizes the magnitude of the moral catastrophe the existing city represents.
And James Jarvis, having internalized his son's vision, is last seen setting his feet toward the boys' club, a small, personal step on a very long road. His personal grief has become a political and moral duty.
It has. And the source material really forces you to grapple with Arthur's final question about the true nature of South African society. Is it a Christian civilization, or is it merely a tragic compound of great ideal and fearful practice? The answer lies in what they choose to do with all this new wealth.
So we're left with this potent cliffhanger from these chapters. The trial of Kumalo's son continues, embodying the tragedy of the broken past, while the discovery of gold at Odendahl's Rust offers a terrifyingly real test of the nation's future conscience. What does a society choose when the pursuit of chaotic generational wealth directly competes with the clear moral duty to uphold justice for all its citizens? That's the exploration that continues long after this deep dive is complete, and it's something we encourage you to keep mulling on, how a single man's personal tragedy can ignite a national moral debate.